Jill Dando was a much admired and popular television presenter for the BBC, who was murdered on her front doorstep on the 26th of April, 1999. It was a crime that was as baffling as it was shocking. One man would spend 8 years in jail for the murder, only to be acquitted. The case remains unsolved to this day. After an early stint in local broadcasting, Dando began a national career as a newsreader. She then moved on to present the holiday programme, as well as the ratings-winning Crime Watch UK. At the time of her death, she was firmly established as a viewer's favourite. On the morning of her murder, Dando had returned from her fiancé's home to her own home, which she no longer frequented, and was in the process of selling. As she opened her front door, she was grabbed from behind, forced downwards, and shot in the head with a 9mm automatic. Death was instantaneous. A neighbour, Helen Doble, found her approximately 15 minutes later. Richard Hughes, her next-door neighbour, had heard a surprised cry from Dando, quote, like someone greeting a friend, but heard no gunshot. Hughes looked out of his front window, and while not realising what had happened, made the only certain sighting of the killer, a 6-foot-tall white man, aged around 40, walking away from Dando's house. The Metropolitan Police formed Operation Oxborough with a huge investigative team, as one would expect, given the high profile and intense publicity surrounding the crime. They talked to over 2,500 people and took more than 1,000 statements. Many theories circulated on the murder. An obsessed fan or jilted ex sprang immediately to mind. Police also examined the possibility of a professional hit, either by a criminal who had been brought to book as a result of Crime Watch UK, or elements involved in conflicts in the Balkans. Jill Dando had fronted news bulletins in the period that included crises in that region, and may have become associated with NATO action against Serbia in the minds of Serbian nationalists. It was even suggested that a professional rival, jealous of her status and popularity, had hired a hitman. A later, and more outlandish theory, was that Dando had been investigating the now-known paedophile activities that were going on at the BBC, principally involving Jimmy Savile, and was silenced because of what she had learned. After a year of investigation, detectives had drawn a blank. Various men who resembled the description of the killer had been seen close to the house on the day, or in the days leading up to the killing. More sightings were reported of men running in streets near the scene. Despite public appeals, reconstructions on Crime Watch, and massive media coverage, the investigation was going nowhere. DCI Hamish Campbell, leading the investigation, appeared again on Crime Watch 1 year on. His remarks would be retrospectively criticised. The contract assassination theory had now been dropped. The Met were now focusing exclusively on the lone killer theory. Campbell described the suspect thus: like the loner, the obsession with firearms, the ability to be in that street at that time on that Monday, and the description. Even if it's not an obsession with Jill Dando, it's an obsession with other women, or an obsession with something else. That's where we're talking about the obsession with guns. A previous gun club member. An interest in guns with specialist books and magazines. As it turned out, the man that Campbell was describing sounded exactly like Barry George. There's lots more to come in this video, but please consider liking, subscribing to the channel, and sharing. And please consider supporting my work with a PayPal donation. The link is in the description. Thank you. George, who lived about half a mile from Dando's house, had a history of stalking women, sexual offences, and other antisocial and attention-seeking behaviour, including claiming to be related to Freddie Mercury. He was also a gun nut and former gun club member. George was already under surveillance. He was arrested on the 25th of May 2000 and charged with Dando's murder on the 28th of May. Though the whole community wanted justice for Jill Dando, there was deep concern that the case against George was thin gruel. He had little apparent interest in the presenter. Identification evidence was weak. He also appeared to have an alibi. Mental illness and epilepsy made it difficult to believe that he could have the wherewithal to execute such a professional and meticulously planned killing. The case hinged on some disputed forensic evidence, a tiny speck of supposed gunshot residue found on George's coat a year after the crime. Nevertheless, George was convicted of murder on the 2nd of July 2001 and sentenced to life imprisonment. 2 subsequent appeals failed. In 2007, after a BBC Panorama programme demolished the scientific evidence against him, the Court of Appeal quashed his conviction and ordered a retrial. This time, George was acquitted. He received substantial damages from national newspapers who had claimed he was guilty, and also printed stories suggesting he had resumed stalking women. However, he was denied compensation by the government for the 8 years he had spent in prison. Campbell and the Metropolitan Police came under heavy fire after the verdict. It was alleged that, under pressure and with no prospect of solving the case, they had simply decided to fit up the local oddball. Campbell's comments on the Crime Watch appeal seemed to suggest that he already had George in the frame and was inviting viewers to fit the evidence around him. In an interview with the Evening Standard in 2013, on the occasion of his retirement, Campbell said he had no regrets. He added, "We, the Met Police, did everything we could to understand that murder and bring the person responsible to court, and we did that, twice." Cold case reviews by the police after 2008 have concluded that Dando was killed by a professional assassin in a so-called hard contact execution. Pressing the gun against her head would have acted as a suppressor, muffling the sound of the shot and preventing the killer from being splattered with blood. More than 20 years on, there are still no answers. The loss of such a talented and popular person in such a senseless manner is still felt by many. Hopefully justice will eventually be done, though as the years go by, those hopes seem more and more unlikely to come to pass.